Hello, and welcome to the Digging Dug podcast. In this episode, I interview Keith Giles. I've been looking forward to this interview. I first discovered Keith and his writings many years ago, and I've got to admit, he is such a prolific writer, and now he's a podcaster as well, not having just one podcast, but actually two that he's a part of. And he's done so much that I haven't been able to keep up with it all. But he's done a lot of interesting writing. I was really impressed with his writing when I first encountered it. In this interview, he has an interesting story, and I get to sit down and talk to him about that. First of all, he was in a rock band who recorded with one of my favorite engineers and producers. We talk about that a little bit. And then he was a pastor at a church and made the tough decision to leave because he felt that all the tithes, all the offerings, all the money that people were giving to the church should actually go to people in need rather than just to keeping the church going. So we also talk about that. He was involved in a house church for many years, had a ministry for kind of the same period to a group of homeless people that were living at a hotel, a local hotel. And then he's also now authored, I think it's getting close to a dozen books. And like I said, has a couple podcasts. And one thing that I mentioned in this interview that I really appreciate about him is that he's continually learning, and I can see that, he's continually growing, learning, and just developing in his faith. And so I've been wanting to do this interview with him for a while now, and finally just got around to doing it. So I hope you'll continue to listen to this episode, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I do. All right. Hello, and welcome to the Digging Dug podcast. I'm really happy to have an acquaintance of mine, Keith Giles, joining today. I've been looking forward to this for a while, so thank you, Keith, for taking the time. So, Keith Giles is a former pastor who left the pulpit to follow Jesus. He is an author, podcaster, public speaker, and blogger. Keith has written a 7-part best-selling book series on deconstruction, the Jesus series, the solo book series focused on embracing the mystery of the divine, and most recently, the quantum series. And I think let's see, let me add this. Co-founder and co-host of Heretic Happy Hour podcast and your solo podcast, Second Cup with Keith. And you are also the co-owner of Choir Publishing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of things there.
Yeah, many hats.
Got a lot of things. So for people's information, I first discovered Keith through his writings. I want to say it maybe back in 2007, 2006, somewhere in that neighborhood. So I've been following Keith, at least from a distance, for quite a while now. And I think he has an interesting story. So I wanted to talk to him and just understand, because again, from my perspective, I've seen that you have grown over time as a Christian, and so I'm curious to learn some about that journey.
Mm-hmm.
So to start out with, tell me your background. Did you grow up as a Christian, or did you come to that later? And if so, how did that come about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, early on, no, I wasn't. I mean, and when I say early, I mean like, probably up to like 5th grade or something. So, my mom, I'm an only child. My mom and dad didn't really take me to church or anything. I went to church, I think, one time with my next door neighbor, who was my best friend at the time. And I think his dad was like an associate pastor or something. So like, I just remember there was one Sunday they took me with them because my friend's dad was speaking at this church. But I'd never been to a church before in my life. I don't remember much at all of the experience. But no, that really wasn't my foundation. Although it's weird is that even though we didn't go to church and we didn't read the Bible or anything like that, I do have a memory of being like really young, again, like first grade, second grade, um, like laying in bed at night and talking to God. So I don't know where I got that from
Hmm.
because the only kind of prayers we would do is like, the typical now I lay me down to sleep kind of things, and, you know, say goodnight kind of a thing. But yeah, so I mean, I felt like I kind of had I was aware that there was a God somehow, and I talked to God a little bit before we started going to church. That was probably like in like third, fourth grade. Maybe we started going to different churches. I nearly became a Mormon for a little while there
Hmm.
because my dad was. I think my dad um, felt like our family needed this, like a spiritual foundation, and but he didn't really have one growing up, so we visited like Methodist churches and Baptist churches for a while there. I think he had a coworker that was Mormon, so we were looking into that for a little while. Thankfully, that didn't happen. We didn't go that way. But yeah, I mean, the big significant thing I think for my whole family was we moved to this little town called Eagle Pass, Texas, on the border because of my dad's work. We went to this little. It's called the Lighthouse Free Will Baptist Church. Um, and yeah, just something clicked, for me and my mom and dad. Um, I made the profession of faith. Um, I think after I did, my mom and dad did. So I kind of was the first one to do it. And then we were all baptized together, which was really cool memory. Um, so yeah, I mean, so that was like I said, like maybe fourth, fifth grade, something like that. And then attended churches off and on as a kid. Went to the youth groups and things like that. So initially not Christian, but then yeah, junior high, elementary school, junior high, high school. Yeah.
Okay. And I knew I wanted to talk briefly. This is a little bit of a side, but since we have this same interest in music,
Oh yeah.
wanted to talk about that. It did the you working and playing in the band. Did that come before you were a pastor, or kind of?
Um, yeah, 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 yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to think of exactly how the timeline happened. My being in a Christian band, I think, came first, which is really odd. Because I had not heard any Christian bands before that, but I was in college,
Hmm.
and I was going to this Baptist student union on campus there, and I was on council there, which was like student leadership kind of stuff. And then a couple other guys in that Baptist student union group. I think there was that the deal was there was okay. I remember the story now. This is how it happened. Um, there was a band my friend Lee Hammer was in. What a great name, right? Lee Hammer. He was the man. He was awesome. I looked up. I idolized this guy. He was the coolest guy, and he sang and played bass for this Christian band here in El Paso called Crossover, and they were a big deal in the Baptist Student Union kind of thing. Um, and they were booked to play an event at the Baptist Student Union um, in like a couple of weeks in advance, right? Well, it turned out that U2 was coming through and they were going to be playing a concert in Las Cruces about an hour away on the Joshua Tree tour. And Lee Hammer was like, "Sorry guys, I'm out. I'm going to go see U2." So they had to
Fair.
scramble. Yeah, they had to scramble. So the guitar player for the crossover, his name was John Dunn, good friend, and he threw together a band literally within like 2 weeks, I think. And so he got me to sing. He got this guy Trent to play drums. He got his friend Greg, who couldn't play anything, to play bass. And we did a couple of cover songs. We actually wrote an original song that's really embarrassingly bad. Anyway, we played like 5 songs at this event. And then what the funny thing was, after the event was over, I also had tickets to the U2 concert. So, I mean, as soon as I finished, I dropped the mic, jumped in the truck with my friend Brett. We drove the hour to get there. We missed the opening band, but we walked in as U2 was playing Where the Streets Have No Name, and I walked into
Hmm.
the crowd. It was just like, it was amazing. So that was
Yeah.
my first Christian band experience. And I was in several other Christian bands over the years. But I think it was after that, which is so bizarre. Because I was really into music before that, but it was all, like, I mean, in high school, I was into like AC/DC and Scorpions and like, like kind of like metal kind of stuff. Um, but I was taking this class with a friend of mine named Kent Williamson, who's passed now, sadly. But he and I had a writing class together, and he gave me a ride after class to my car. So I get in his car, and he's got all these cassette tapes and CDs and just all over the bottom of the car. And it's like Altar Boys, The Choir, the 77s, Undercover, 441, and I'm like, whoa, what's all this? And he goes, oh, dude, check this out. And he like throws one of them in, and it's like, I think it was The Choir or something. And I was like, wow, what is this? Because all I had heard up to this point was Petra and Amy Grant, and I was like not impressed.
Yeah.
And I had friends always, like, people in church telling me because they knew how much I was into like the heavy metal kind of stuff. Oh, you should listen to Christian music. But then that's all they gave me was like Petra, like the coloring
Right.
song. I'm like, no, I'm sorry, dude, that's not doing it. So I thank goodness for my friend Kent Williamson. He let me borrow like his Altar Boys, When You're a Rebel, and The Choir. I think Diamonds and Rain, and the 77s. Probably the Island record that they had. Anyway, I mean
Yeah.
that I took those home, and my mind was blown. And then I went to maybe about a month or so later. There was a little Baptist bookstore in town, and I went in looking for music for that kind of music, and their music section was a joke. It literally was like it was nothing. It was like maybe 10 CDs or 10 cassettes or something. It was horrible. And I ended up getting a job there when I was going to college. So my job was I ran the music department there, and I was a huge fan of it. So I started listening. I started subscribing to CCM magazine and reading all the reviews, and just like I ate it up. I was such a huge fan of that music, um, and I discovered more bands, right, more artists and stuff. And I just got to be. I was a walking encyclopedia for all this kind of stuff. When the sales reps would come into the store to pitch me the new album, I knew more than they did. One guy even told me that. He goes, dude, I don't even know why I bring this book with me, because he'd have a little book, with all the information. I'm like, he goes, you know more than I do. So I ended up getting a job for one of those record companies after I graduated college. That's what took me to Southern California. So I worked
Ah,
for,
okay.
yeah, I worked for Diamante Music Group. They were a distribution company. And my first sales conference with Diamante was also Brandon Ebel's first sales conference with Tooth and Nail Records. And that was amazing. Like, so I got to be there on day one with Tooth and Nail. Um, I mean, these bands. I can tell you, like, one of my favorite memories was my very first sales conference. I'm brand new. I'm sitting in the room, right? And so what happens at the sales conference is the record labels come in and they pitch you their albums, the records that are going to come out for that quarter or whatever, right? That you're going to be selling. And so they're trying to hype you up. So, dude, I'm sitting there, front row. Mike Knott walks in with a guitar. He pulls up a chair, and standing in front of me, just like, you know, 5 feet away, is Mike Knott, and he's doing a private concert, and he does Deaf and Dumb from the Browbeat record, which no one had ever heard that song, dude. I'm one of the first 10 people to ever hear that song live from Mike Knott standing in front of me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then Mortal came in after that. The guys from Mortal, they had spent all night mixing their track for that same record, and they played it for us. We got to hear that for the first time on tape. And so, like, that was my first sales conference. I was like, oh my gosh. And then Brandon Ebel stood up and pitched Wish for Eden, which was, not a great record, but it was interesting. Anyway, no, that was my thing. And so I had a great time working for Diamante, getting to know a lot of these bands, members of these bands, and became friends with a lot of them. That at first I was just a fan. So like I'm good friends with the guys from Prayer Chain and Mortal, and those two are the ones I'm still in touch with. But I got to meet all these guys. Even Mike Knott, I
Yeah.
interviewed him. I interviewed Mike Knott for a magazine I was writing for at the time. Um, that was a blast just to meet him and his family. And I interviewed him a couple of times. Mike Pritzel from Violet Burning, same thing. I interviewed him a couple times. It was a
Yeah.
really
Great
amazing
guy.
experience. Yeah.
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 Can I tell you my Pritzel story real quick? It's super short.
Yeah.
I was interviewing him again for one of these magazines, and we met in Long Beach, right? So I lived in Orange County, so it was a bit of a drive. So I drive out to this coffee shop. I sit there with my tape recorder. I have this great conversation with Mike Pritzel, and then after we're finished the interview, it's like 10 o'clock at night. Um, it felt like it. Maybe it wasn't, but it was late. It was like maybe 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. Anyway, we just start talking about music, and Mike Pritzel goes, "Oh, have you heard this band called Sigur Rós?" I'm like, "No, what's that?" He goes, "Oh, come with me." And we go across the street to a record shop. We go into the record shop. He finds the CD for Sigur Rós. He buys it and he gives it to me. And I listened to it on the way home. And I was just like blown away. Like, first of all, I couldn't believe he bought it and gave it to me. But
Yeah.
just hearing that album for the first time was just, it did blow my mind. So yeah, just great people. You know what I mean? I got to meet some of these guys and they're really great people. And was a huge fan. It was fun to be in a band also. And my band got to record at the Green Room. Gene Eugene mixed our record. It was a dream. I got to kind of live that rock and roll dream for a little bit anyway. You
Yeah.
know, it was fun.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know, I grew up on a lot of that music. Uh, Maybe a little bit more of the sort of mainstream Christian stuff when I was in junior high and high school. Yeah, like my first exposure was Petra,
Yeah,
and which like at the time, some of the early '90s, it was like okay. But anyway, as I grew up and became a young adult, like I found more of the alternative music and
yeah.
ended up I was able to go to Cornerstone. I think 15 years.
Oh my gosh!
Um,
See, that's one thing I
yeah,
never got to do. So you got one up on me on there.
yeah. But as a young adult, I always wanted to have Gene Eugene's job.
Uh huh.
Like I wanted to get into producing and recording, and I tell people, and this is maybe still true today, that I think he had a hand in more of the
Yeah.
music I listened to
Yep.
than any other single person, just because
Yeah.
he was involved in so much from producing and recording and all that. So
That's the
yeah,
truth.
so
Honestly, yeah. If you go and look at like if you're a fan of that Christian alternative stuff from the '90s, especially, um, look at
yeah.
how many of those records were recorded at the Green Room, which means that's where Gene that was his house, by the way. So if it was recorded at the Green Room, even if his name wasn't on the production, he was there. He had something to do with it. So he either recorded it or mixed it or produced it or engineered it. And also someone else that I didn't notice at the time, but I'm starting to go back and notice now is Steve Hindalong from the choir. Like he produced the Prayer Chain records, like a bunch of stuff. Like I didn't even know. He co-wrote some of the songs. He co-wrote some songs for Adam again. He co-wrote some songs for a bunch of different bands and produced a bunch of bands. So yeah,
Yeah,
those two guys had pretty big influence.
yeah. I don't know if you're aware, but I am playing in a band now, an
Oh,
alternative rock band called Rusty Ship. So I play
cool.
bass
What
for
do you
them
do?
and been doing that for a few years.
Okay, well, that's fun, man. I kind of wish I was still doing it. I miss being in a band.
Yeah. Well, let's continue. How did you go from working as a rep, working in all this alternative rock music, to becoming a pastor?
Yeah. Well, so the funny thing is, I became a pastor before I moved to California. So I was in college, going to college. I was on staff at the church, the Southern Baptist Church, um, there here in El Paso, um, and I ended up becoming the music minister there full time after the previous guy had passed away. He was kind of my mentor.
Ooh,
Um,
excuse me.
yeah, and so I was licensed and ordained pretty quickly, pretty soon after I got married. I think it was the same year I got married here in El Paso. So the thing about being licensed and ordained Southern Baptist, and it's good to clarify this for people because people assume that when I say I was licensed and ordained as a Southern Baptist and I was a pastor, like I didn't go to Bible college, I didn't go to seminary. I'm all self-taught, and so in the Southern Baptist, you can be licensed and ordained without having to do any of that for better or
Okay.
worse. So yeah, I was licensed and ordained and served on staff at different churches, two different churches here in El Paso. I did youth ministry, music ministry. Then when I graduated college, got the job at Diamante, moved to Southern California. Um, did that job for like 3.5 years. Sometime in there, my wife Wendy and I got involved in the Vineyard Church, and we're doing children's ministry at a Vineyard Church there. Then I worked at Vineyard Music Group, in the worship music company, and that was a lot of fun. Did that for about 3.5 years. Um, then after that, we ended up planting a church with some friends of ours in Tustin, California. That was also a Vineyard Church, and that was my final really kind of on staff church experience. Although I did serve at Soul Survivor Church as an associate pastor for maybe about a year after that, just kind of
Were
helping those guys out
you
for a while.
were you a lead pastor or just one of the staff
No,
pastors at the? Okay.
no, no. So yeah, in my pastoral career, I was never a lead pastor, but I did everything else: youth ministry, children's ministry, music ministry. I did compassion ministry, which was a ministry of the poor in our community. Um, social justice kind of stuff like that. So yeah, I served on a bunch of different kind of uh, positions. I was an associate pastor at Soul Survivor Church in Costa Mesa for about a year and a half or so. And then we left and did our house church. We did that for about 11 years. And I wasn't the pastor there either. I wasn't
Yeah,
the
well,
leader
I
or
was
the
going to
boss of
ask
that. Yeah.
that how that shifted because, as I recall, from what I recall, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, that you um, since that or became convicted that the money that people were donating to the church
Yeah.
should go toward poor and needy in ministry rather than just kind of keeping the
Yeah.
church going.
Yeah.
And that is what led you to leave as a pastor and get involved in this small church. And I wanted to ask if, like, was that a hard decision to make?
Yeah. It was. So yeah, you're exactly right. So um, Wendy and I were on staff at this church, so we helped to plant the vineyard church called the River in Tustin. Um, did that for about three years or so. For the most part, enjoyed it. It was actually really good. But near the end of it, Wendy and I started feeling, well, at first we were feeling like we felt like God was calling us to leave and start another church. We didn't know what that was, but we were feeling like the experience of planting a church from scratch, which we had never done before. But we had, this is the first time we had done it at this church. We thought it was really great. It was a great feeling. And so we kind of felt like, okay, this is something we felt like God was calling us to do. And then around that time, I read this article by a guy named Ray Mayhew. It's a little PDF article. I'm happy to share it with anybody who wants to read it. It blew my mind. It was called Embezzlement, the Corporate Sin of American Christianity. And it's all about looking at, starting with the church in the book of Acts, the first century church going through the second century, third century, and documenting how the prioritizing caring for the orphan and the widow and the poor was really the genesis of the early church. It really was the reason why why the church grew so quickly. Is because they saw this incredible love and outpouring for the outcasts and that kind of thing. So we were already doing that kind of work at that church plant, doing ministry to the poor in the community, and so that really resonated with us. Like, wow, how cool would it be to have a church that gave 100% of the offering to the poor in the community? That was the vision. And we couldn't figure out how to do that. Like, because that's what the first century church did, right? When you read the book of Acts, right? They took a collection and they laid it at the apostles' feet, and that was distributed to again, the poor, the widow, the orphan, and that kind of thing. And so that's what they did with their money. Paul is very vocal about that, actually. Like he makes a big deal about the fact in his letters that he works for free, that he doesn't take any kind of money to preach the gospel. In fact, he's like, I dare anyone to try to take this boast from me that I didn't make any money, from preaching the gospel. So that became our vision of like, okay, somehow we feel like whatever God's calling us to do is to plant this church that gives everything away to the poor in the community. But we didn't know how to do that. And then we just kind of like, it was like I think Wendy just looked at me one evening and she said, "I think we're talking about a house church." And
Hmm.
at the time I thought that was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. I just thought, who does that? No one does that. And so I'll tell you a story what happened about that. So Wendy said that I had that thought. Who does that? This is silly, right? No one does that. And I remember praying about that and saying, God, if you want us to do this, you have to show me because again, no, who does this, right? No, who does a house church nowadays? And like that night, there was a men's group, and I went to the men's group, and I'm talking to one of the guys at the men's group, or just small talk, whatever. And he says, "Oh, you live on this street?" And I go, "Yeah, we live on this street." And he goes, "My daughter lives on that street too." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's cool." And he goes, "Yeah, they've been doing a house church there for about 3 years." I'm like, "What?" So it was like God saying, "Hey, Keith, not only do people do this, there's someone on your street right now doing it." So we got to know that couple, and that couple ended up being when we finally did leave to start our church. Their group was winding down. They came with us, and so we kind of were with them for a little while too. And so yeah, it was just a really cool experience. The vision for it was like I wasn't the pastor. Even though I was licensed and ordained, like I didn't want to be the Bible answer man. I wanted to be the Bible question man. I wanted to let the Holy Spirit work through the body. So everyone got a chance to use their gifts, and it wasn't just about me, which was difficult to do, right? Because we're kind of in the West, we're kind of wired for the pastor, for the leader to answer all the Bible questions and kind of do all the ministry. So, like sometimes I would leave the room, I wouldn't come back until they were all talking without me, and then I would slip in the back. Um, so yeah, it was
Well,
a wonderful experience. Yeah, it was really great.
yeah, I'm curious about kind of what you were doing from what I understand with the house church. Ended up being a part of what, at least from my perspective, seemed to be a movement at that time
Yeah,
that some people called organic church
yep,
or simple
yep,
church. And
yep.
but I'm curious, like how much of that sort of the paradigm behind that did you know before starting, like becoming a part of the house church, and how much of that kind of developed during that
Yeah,
time?
I didn't know anything about it. I mean, we started this house church, and I had no clue what I was doing. And different people let me borrow different books at the time, if I can remember. Wolfgang Simpson has a book called Houses That Changed the World. There's another book. I can't remember the man's name, but his wife's name is Julia Banks. Is it Banks? I want to say Robert and Julia Banks, something like that. They have a book called The Church Comes Home. I think that's what it's called. So, and those two books were very helpful at the time because what they told us was there was no one way to do it. Neither of those books said this is the right way to do it. Both books gave us examples of different paradigms that other groups had followed, but none of them said this is the right way or the wrong way. And so that gave us permission to really just sort of like allow our group to develop in the ways that we felt made the most sense. Um, so yeah, we kind of learned as we went along, kind of made a bunch of mistakes and learned from those mistakes. Um, I got to know Neil Cole during that time because he also lived in Long Beach. So someone introduced me to him. I met some other house church groups. The great thing is when you're first doing it, like I thought we were the only ones, and then you realize like, oh, that you meet these people over here, these people over there. I actually even started like a little website that was it was like it was a way for people if they Google searched House Church Orange County, all the different groups in the area would pop up, and like the location, what times they meet, and all that kind of stuff. So the more I got to meet other people, I would add them to the list, and I would visit whenever we could. We visit them, just to have a connection with them, and so it was a great experience. I'm really happy we got to be a part of that, and of course because I was in that movement at the time, and I was meeting different people. I also met a guy named Ken Eastburn, who also lived there locally, and he became the director of House to House Ministries, which was a nationwide house church ministry. And I started doing they did a newsletter, like a magazine so I did an online magazine for them. I met Frank Viola, who was a big deal in that group, that movement at the time. So yeah, I felt very fortunate. I felt like I was kind of I mean, I know it had been going for a while before that, but it felt like when we were doing it, we were kind of in the wave. You know what I mean? Like it was starting to really gain momentum. Like ABC News had done stories about it. 60 Minutes had done a story about it. USA Today had written an article about it. Like people were noticing that this organic church thing was happening. George Barna's book, Revolution, had come out, and he was talking about that the future of church was people were going to be leaving the church. Really was predicting the deconstruction movement before anyone knew, this was coming. He predicted that we were going to see a trend that people were going to, especially younger people, were going to leave traditional churches and find community elsewhere, spiritual community and connection outside of the church, and that happened.
That's I have been curious, looking back now, how you kind of look back on that, and then also, I know I have sort of had the impression that that wave, if you will, there was like a movement at the time, but I feel like I haven't heard as much about it, and I don't know if that's just me or if it was one of those things that was kind of there was kind of a moment where it was more
Yeah.
popular, if you will, and
Yeah.
that's waned somewhat. Is
I couldn't tell you honestly, because I can only tell you I'm no longer part of the house church kind of movement anymore. There was a ton of Facebook groups. I ran a couple of them, and I'm not part of those Facebook groups anymore. Um, Mostly, not only because we did. Excuse me, Wendy and I did house church up until like 6 years ago when we moved to El Paso. And when we moved to El Paso 6 years ago, our intention was to start one. Um, but we just never found anyone. We didn't find the people that are interested in doing it. It was just basically it would have been us. So I was like, well, okay, never mind. We didn't end up starting one. So I can just tell you that's my experience. So I'm tempted to agree with you that it's probably not a thing anymore. But what do I know? Maybe for all I know, there's people that are really into it and it's taken off, and there's people involved that I don't know who they are. I don't know their names. I don't know anything about them, right? Because house churches
yeah,
tend to be a little isolationist, like they don't want to be part of the bigger picture, a lot of them. And so that's kind of the challenge too, is like, that's why I did that little website that I did, because like, if like right now, anyone listening to this podcast, there could be 10 different house church groups that meet in your town, and you would never know it because they don't put up signs, they don't advertise, right? How would you know? You'd have to know someone who knew someone that was doing it. You know what I mean? It's all word of mouth.
right.
So it's really difficult to find one. And other than maybe gauging it by like the popularity of a Facebook group that was devoted to it, I don't really know now how you would gauge if it's still a thing or not. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know during that time when you were in Southern California, you and I believe your house church was involved in a ministry, I think a very organic ministry to people living at a hotel.
Yeah, yeah,
Do you want to mention that
yeah,
at all? Kind of what that experience was like, what you learned
yeah.
from it?
That was an amazing experience. Yeah, honestly, we started that motel ministry. It was a motel in Santa Ana. We started that when we were still at that church, the River Church in Tustin. Um, and when we left and started our house church, I requested that our house church could continue to do that ministry because it was just such a part of our family and what we were doing. And so that the church didn't care. They were like, "Yeah, sure, you guys can keep going." Um, yeah, it was really beautiful, and it did still. It had a very very organic kind of a flavor to it. Like we never brought attention to ourselves. Even when we were at the river, at the other church when it was the River Vineyard doing it, like nobody wore their T-shirt, from from the church. We didn't advertise what church we were from. We just like blessed people, and we blessed them up front. We wasn't like, well, first listen to a sermon and then we'll give you some food or whatever. It's like, no, we're gonna put up the bounce house. We're gonna let the kids play. We're gonna, give out hot dogs. We're gonna give out free groceries. And if you want prayer, we'll pray with you. But if you don't, that's okay. And that was our model. We started doing a church on Sunday mornings in the back parking lot of this motel. Um, and then so again, when the house church started, we continued like once a month. We would do that. So instead of meeting at a house, we would show up and serve there at the motel. And then other through the Orange County Rescue Mission, a few other local churches also kind of joined us in that, so that other churches in the area would each take a Sunday. So we would do one Sunday, but then other churches would fill the other Sundays. And one of those churches was Saddleback Church, which is so crazy. I used to joke that, what if the biggest church in Orange County partnered with the smallest church in Orange County to plant a church in the motel, parking lot? And that was an amazing experience. What's really, really cool about that is everything we did at that motel church, partnering the way we did it, the philosophy of how we did it, and all that. The guy from Saddleback ended up. His name is Ron Wilbur. He ended up creating motelchurch.com, which I think is still up. And so it's a website where other churches all across the country can sign up and follow the model, and then they can also basically host a church in a motel in their community as well, but following the model that we created. So that's really cool. It's cool to know that it spread way beyond what we were doing. But just an amazing experience just to get to meet these people and to be involved in their lives on a regular basis, and seeing families with children, getting to know their kids. We went to the high school graduations for several of those kids, even after we stopped doing it, like we would go back and go to the graduations and stuff. So it was really beautiful, just a really wonderful experience. Like for me, I don't know, between the house church and the motel church, like that was really some of the most beautiful, just church experiences I've ever had. Right. The best thing I've ever done with the word church on it, just because it was so Jesus focused, you know what I mean? It was so much just about loving people and serving them, and without all the garbage in the way, right? There was no titles, there was no bank accounts, 501c3s, anything like that. It was just people that loved Jesus and who loved people and who wanted to serve and be a blessing. Yeah, it was just really wonderful.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. That's great. I appreciate you sharing about that. I am curious. I wanted to ask about how you got involved in writing. I think it was somewhere during that time frame when I first ran across some of your writings. So I know you were writing articles and blogging and everything. Is that something that you had wanted to become an author, or were doing for a long time, or how
Yeah,
did you get going in that?
yeah, yeah. Interesting. So it was. So this was when I was still at. It's about the time we started planting that church. And the job I had before that, I worked for a company called Ingram Micro, and it was a really, uh, gosh, it was a hard job. It was all like technical stuff, right? I was working, doing spreadsheets for Apple Computer and tracking their shipments and truckload shipments of iMac computers. And I'm a creative person, so that I hated dealing with numbers and formulas and spreadsheets, and it was driving me crazy. So as a kid, I always wanted to be a writer. Like that was kind of my thing as a kid. Like I didn't want to be a fireman or a dinosaur, whatever. It was like I want to be a writer, and I love science fiction and comics and all that kind of stuff. So initially, that was my dream. I thought I'm going to be a science fiction writer, but so when I was working at Ingram Micro and it was all technical, I started writing these science fiction stories and stuff. And then online, I found these artists that were amazing. And some of them now are still working. They're currently drawing like Spider-Man, X-Men, stuff. But at the time they were nobodies. They were just kids with websites. And I found some of these people and I said, hey, I'm a writer and I've got some stories and I can't pay you anything, but would you want to do some comics with me? And they said, sure. So we started this thing called Plastic Animal Studios, which I think the website's still up, plasticanimalstudios.com. I can't believe it's still up after all this time. And yeah, so I wrote all these stories, sci-fi kind of stories, and I had these different artists working on them. We did a little ash cam. We went to San Diego Comic-Con. I got one of the stories published in an anthology. Ironically enough, that story was called Hard Video, and next year I'm going to publish a novella based on that story. So it hasn't gone away. But anyway, so that's what I was doing just to kill the boredom, and because I was just like creatively I was starving, I was dying. But we started this church that I mentioned, right? The Vineyard Church. We planted that church with our friends, and one of the guys I met at that church, his name was Scott Lawman, and he's a painter, like an amazing like fine artist. He's really great. He has done he worked for like Rolling Stone magazine, Spin magazine, like
Mm.
painting stuff for their articles and New York Times and all kinds of stuff. He's really great. Anyway, he and I went to lunch one day. When I still same thing when I had this job, right, this technical job, and I was doing the comics and all that stuff, and he just kind of like he was like it was like a catalyst for me. That conversation that we had over lunch was so impactful to me. Like what Scott started showing me was like what he got me thinking about was what if I used my talent for writing for the kingdom? Like what would that look
Mm.
like? What if I used my creativity, for the kingdom? And I remember driving back to work from that lunch meeting with Scott, knowing that I was going to shut down Plastic Animal Studios and I was going to start blogging.
Mm.
And I did. I mean, I basically sent an email to the artist. I said, "Hey guys, this has been a lot of fun. I'm not going to write any more comic stuff. If you want to finish the comic you're working on, that's great. But I just want you to know I'm going to shift gears here." And so I started a blog. I reached out to Relevant Magazine at the time, which was only online. They hadn't printed magazines yet. And so I reached out to them and said, "Hey, I wanted to pitch an idea for a column and called Subversive, and I'll interview different people about the church." And this was during the time when the emerging church movement was happening, right? So Brian McLaren and there was a website called the ooze.com with Spencer Burke and a bunch of other people like that. And so I started writing articles and submitting articles to those different kind of emerging church websites and blogs. And you probably read some of those. And
I
then,
think maybe I first ran across you I think maybe it was the Ooze.
yeah, the ooze. I was writing for the ooze. There was one called Seed Stories. There was one called uh, Gink World. It's a weird name, Gink World.
Hmm.
A bunch. Anyway, they were all kind of the same. And then I wrote for Relevant Magazine. And so that was the shift for me that I decided I'm going to start writing. I'm going to start blogging. I'm going to write about kind of like spiritual things and kind of what was happening with me at the time. And then of course, right around that time is when I had my personal deconstruction experience. So I wrote about that. And then we left and started the house church. So I started writing about our house church experience. Um, and then after a while, after a couple of years of blogging, I collected some of those blog posts and self-published a couple of books. I self-published about 6 books, I think, before my book Jesus Untangled, which Choir published. And so that was when I really started, because Choir was a real publisher. I wasn't just self-publishing. I actually had a real publisher, and that was an amazing
Yeah.
experience. Yeah, that was just really a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah. And I wanted to get to that. That's a good transition to you kind of you were doing all this writing for this number of years and the blogging and articles and everything, and then that eventually led you to writing the books. And as you mentioned, the first ones that actually were published were this what you came to call the Un series, which
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want to say there were
7 of them. Yeah,
seven Un books on topics. Let's see. You argue against common evangelical perspectives on the Bible, hell, nationalism, eschatology, violence, the church. What would you like to share about those books, about your um, the motivation or passion
yeah,
behind those, and because part of what I want to do with this interview in general is let people know about what writing you have, and so I want to give you this
sure.
opportunity to share about it.
Yeah, okay, sure. Thank you. Um, well, so the first book that I wrote in that series, which of course at the time I did not know was going to be a series, I just was going to write a book, right? Was Jesus Untangled, which was the subtitle was "Crucifying Our Politics to Pledge Allegiance to the Lamb." This was this was probably 2016, I guess. So it was
Mm,
during the Trump's first and Trump and Hillary, running for office. even before that, though, I had noticed like the rise of Christian nationalism and things that bothered me about. I'd see different Christians post different things about nationalism, and so initially, what I did, and I think I'd forgotten this, but I just looked it up recently again, and to refresh my memory. I wrote a series of blogs first, and I reached out to a friend of mine. I take that back. He reached out to me. He sent me an email privately, just like Keith. I'm losing my mind. It really scares me when I see all these Christians shifting to nationalism and how dangerous it is and all that, and I don't know what to do. And I said, well, okay, why don't you and I just write a series of blog posts together? And we did that. We wrote a series. I think Chuck McKnight jumped in and did one or two in the series as well. So we had probably like 10 or 12 blogs in the series that I did. After I wrote those blogs, I realized like, oh my gosh, this could be a book, right? There was so much material. So that's when I wrote Jesus Untangled and ended up publishing it with Choir, which I'm so glad I did. I mean, up to that point, I was self-publishing, and it was wonderful just to have someone like Ralph come alongside me, and it was wonderful. Um, so yeah, that book published. Actually, we set it up so that it would publish on the inauguration day. So it was the day Donald Trump was sworn in the first time my book came out, and so it's funny because I look back on that now, and at the time I was writing about the dangers of Christian nationalism. It was sort of like, hey everybody, this is what could happen if we're not careful. And now it's sort of like, this is what's happening already, and no one listened to me. Or
Yeah.
I'm not the only one. There was a lot of other people at the time, raising the alarms. But that was the first book in the series. And then something that I just mentioned in that book, but then I realized I felt like that could be a book of its own. In Jesus Untangled, I had a chapter about approaching the Bible and how we approach the Bible and how the way we approach the Bible um, matters. You know what I mean? Like, what I discovered, ironically, what I discovered as I was studying the early church movement, I came across this article, a book um, called "The Reformers and Their Stepchildren" by a guy named Leonard Verdu. And in that book, he's looking at the reformers, right? So Martin Luther and John Calvin, and the Anabaptists, and how those two movements initially were together. I mean, they inspired each other. They knew each other, right? They were fellowshipping and had a community with each other. After the Reformation, however, when the reformers have the support of the government, it's very similar to what happened with Constantine. Those Christians, the reformers, began to enforce their doctrines under the threat of the sword. And so Christians, Anabaptists, were put to death. They were tortured, they were drowned, they were imprisoned, beaten. Horrible, horrible things happened. And in the book, what Leonard Verdun points out is that the foundational difference between the reformers and the Anabaptists was essentially the way they approached the Bible. That the reformers had a flat Bible perspective, meaning to them, there's just there's one book, the Bible, written by God, and everything from Genesis to Revelation, it's all the Word of God, and it all has equal value and weight and authority. And I read that and I'm like, yeah, that's how I was raised. Is there another way? I didn't know. What are you talking about? There's another way.
Right.
And then he said, oh, but the Anabaptists took a Jesus centric perspective, meaning that for them, Jesus, right, is like, according to the Gospel of John, no one has ever seen God at any time except for the Son. And as the Father says on the Mount of Transfiguration, this is my Son, listen to him. So it prioritizes Jesus and the words of Christ. And so the way they read the Bible was to prioritize Christ and the words of Jesus and the red letters, the Sermon on the Mount. And then they would interpret and filter everything else in the Bible through Jesus, which is very different, right? This Jesus-centric approach. And that just blew my mind. So I mentioned it. I had, like I said, I had a chapter in Jesus Untangled about it. I felt like I needed to expand that concept into an entire book. So the second book is Jesus Unbound, about liberating the Word of God from the Bible. I always, by the way, recommend, it's a 7-part book series. I recommend people start with Jesus Unbound because it is so foundational. I think the way you approach the Scripture is so critical, and it will impact the way you understand everything else in your theology. if you approach it either from a flat Bible perspective or if you approach it from a Jesus-centric perspective. So that's what the second book was about. Ironically, a couple of friends of mine told me at the time not to write that book. And it's become my best-selling book. I think of all the Jesus Un series, that's the best-selling book.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is I wouldn't have guessed, actually. I would have guessed it was Jesus Undefeated, the one about hell. That's the number 2 one. But then it just chronologically, after I did Unbound about the Bible, I wrote a book about house church, right? So that was, I just lost the title of my book. What was it? Jesus Unveiled. Thank you. Jesus Unveiled. And so what I did on that book was I had self-published a book previously called This Is My Body. But I felt like it was incomplete, and actually by that time I changed my mind about a few things. So I rewrote This Is My Body. I added a whole, probably another 50% more material at the end of that book that was very much how to. As far as I know, there's not a lot of books out there on organic church that are literally like, here's how to do it. Most of them talk about it in theory, but they don't tell you anything like, how do I do that? How do I pull that off?
Right.
So I just told a lot of the stories of things that we had done, things we had learned. And yeah, so that was the third book, Jesus Unveiled. The fourth book was Jesus Undefeated. That's the one about the doctrine of hell, which my publisher, by the way, Raphael Polindo, convinced me to write. I did not want to write that book, but he
Huh.
talked me into it, and I'm glad he did, because like I said, it was probably the second best-selling one. And I've had so many people thank me for that book that it's really helped them.
Mm.
In that book, what I did was I look at, there's 3 biblical views of hell, right?
Right.
The one we all know, eternal conscious torment, but then there's also annihilation and then universal reconciliation. And so in the book, I present all 3 views. I give the biblical support for all 3 views, and then I examine that support. Like, is that a strong argument? Like, are these scriptures really saying that? Are they supporting this doctrine? And I also look at church history and how, like, for the first 400 years of church history, the majority of Christians in the early church embraced the doctrine of universal reconciliation or patristic universalism, which again, I never knew that. That was like, what? That was a shock to me. So I just wanted to make sure I put all those details in the book, hopefully to help people make up their own minds about that topic. And then I did a book called Jesus Unexpected, which is about the second coming and dispensationalism and all the end times hype. And that one was, again, just looking at how John Nelson Darby invented this doctrine in 1850, and then no one believed this before him, and how Schofield basically stuck it in his Bible and sold it to Americans who decided that those notes, that Darby's notes in Schofield's Bible were scripture. And so then there's Christians in America can't think of any other way to think about the second coming except that. So I wanted to expose that a little bit and hopefully turn the temperature down on all that nonsense. And then the final book in the series was Jesus Unarmed, which again, my publisher convinced me to write. I'd written 6 books, and I thought, I'm done. 6, that's good. That's a nice round number. And he was like, no, but you have to write 7 because 7 is the number of completion. But I think he just really wanted me to write a book on nonviolence because it's something I care about and I've talked about a lot. But I did have a book on it. So I wrote the final book is Jesus Unarmed, looking at the Christian nonviolence. And again, looking at scripture, looking at history, and examining that whole discussion. So I'm very, very proud of that series. Like I said, I didn't start off intending to write a 7-part book series. I'm really proud of it. I'm still hear today from people that are just discovering some of those books and how those books have helped them. And that's great because that's why I wrote them. The way I write my books, I'm not dogmatic. I'm not trying to say like I'm right and you're wrong. But I do want to say here's some history, here's some evidence, here's maybe a different perspective on some of these scriptures than you've heard before. I just want people to consider and think. They don't have to land where I land, but at the end of the day, I hope my books are helpful in people as they're processing, what they believe about these different things. So yeah, it's been great to hear feedback from people. I'm very happy to know that those books are still out there and still helping people answer some of those questions.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I haven't read them all. I haven't been able to. You've written so much. I haven't been able to keep up with everything, but those topics are really important. And so, yeah, it's a good set, and it's good to have that out there because a lot of that content, I think, is uh, a perennial in the sense of, it's not just like the topic of the day or
Right.
whatnot, but it's like something that's really applicable long term.
Yeah, I think
Um,
Christians are always going to have these questions and always going to be curious
right,
about these topics. Yeah.
right, yeah, for a long time. I wanted to ask because one of the things I respect about you, from my observation, is that I see that you are always growing, and it's kind of, I mentioned even at the beginning that I've seen you change some over the course of time
Yeah.
in your views and everything, and certainly respect that. And so from my perspective, again, kind of a little bit distance in
Yeah.
watching social media and in blogs and things like that. I know that we talked about the unseries, and a lot of those ideas aren't the mainstream Christianity at all,
Yeah.
not mainstream evangelicalism. However, since then, um, I feel, or like my impression has been, that you have potentially been more antagonistic in some of your titles and in some of the things you share on social media, and also in some of the things that you have written about or have become involved in, um, have seemed to be, like you were going further. And just to give some people some ideas,
Sure.
a few of the blog titles I pulled out: "How Your Bible Is Lying to You,"
Yeah.
"Please Stop Worshiping Jesus,"
Uh-huh.
"Seven Reasons Why Jesus Was Not Sacrificed for Your Sins,"
Oh, yeah.
um, "I'm Going Full Heretic," and now I know you're a co-host of the Heretic Heretic Happy Hour.
Right, right, right.
So yeah, could you? I'm curious to know about. I guess maybe I have kind of two questions here, and one is maybe how your thinking has grown,
Yeah.
and also how intentional you are about maybe some of those kind of things. About it seems to me, again, like you're poking people some, and
A little bit.
how
Yeah.
intentional is that? What is the motivation behind you doing that and kind of being
Sure.
controversial?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, you just reminded me. I didn't list all 7 books. Jesus Unforsaken is in there somewhere too. Actually, I think it was before the final book. That was the 6th book. Jesus
Okay,
Unforsaken was a
yeah,
book about the cross and atonement theories, right? Penal substitutionary atonement theory, which was the hardest one I wrote. Anyway, it jogged my memory
hmm,
because one of the blogs that you mentioned, like what is it, 7 Reasons Jesus Didn't Die for Your Sins? That blog was kind of based on probably around the time I was writing the book, or maybe the book had come out and I wrote that blog post to kind of like point to the book. So, well, I'll just say in general, like I kind of have always done that in my blogging. Like, you know,
yeah,
you want people to read your article, and if you just do a kind of a boring kind of a title, they're not going to click on it. So I do sometimes write salacious titles to try to get people, like, whoa, what's he talking about? Yeah, like yeah, like all those titles that you mentioned. There's many others that I've written like that. Um, so I'm not trying to be controversial for the sake of controversy, but I do want people to think about stuff. So yeah, I will challenge. I will have challenging titles to my blogs because I do want people to engage with what I'm saying and think about what I'm saying. Um, and usually they won't do that unless you're kind of like provoking them a little bit, like, whoa, what are you talking about? Um, so, but I don't want to just like be controversial for the sake of being controversial. Honestly, early on in my blogging, I did do that. I was almost wanting to kind of make people mad. And I finally like backed off of that. Like, yeah, I don't really want to make people angry because then they're not really thinking clearly. Um, but but those titles that you read are like they are shocking, but it's to get you to read what I'm saying. And like I'm going to back it up. So if I'm saying that, and it's not, I'm not. What do they call it? Clickbaiting. Like, oh, you're saying one thing, but I click on it, and that's
yeah,
not what you're talking about. It's just to get you to click. Um,
Right.
Usually that's the title, like, no, I am going to give you 7 reasons why I don't think Jesus died for your sins. So, things like that. So I want people to think about it. But usually, yeah, I'm intentionally crafting a title that gets them to think. And I have changed my mind about a lot of things over time. And like after I finished that Jesus Un series, especially, um, I was just personally at a place of kind of like, now what, Like I had finished the series, I was done with that, and I personally, again, I wrote those books on those topics because I myself was struggling with those things or asking those questions. It wasn't just like, oh, what book should I write now? It was like, this is what I'm going through right now, right? I'm wrestling with this question, or I'm studying this on my own, and I'm learning something, and I'm like, oh wow, people should know this, so I'm going to write a book about it. So it's very natural progression of my personal spiritual development. You can kind of trace it from Jesus Untangled to Jesus Unarmed. And so I finished that series. And at the same time, during that time I was publishing those books, I started this group called Square One, which was an online course and a community, a private Facebook community that was helping people that are deconstructing their faith, right? And so every Saturday, I'm on like an hour Zoom call with people, hearing their stories and helping them process all their stuff. And then so Square One became Square Two, and then Square Two became Square Three, and Square Three is basically just every Sunday. There's like a 2-hour Zoom call with these people who've gone through Square One and Two, who just wanted to continue. We developed a community, so we wanted to continue talking. And so that's kind of where my church is now, really, is the Square Three group. Wendy and I, that's our community, that's our connection. And so during that time in the Square Three group, um, yeah, I was processing just a lot of things myself. Where am I at personally? And what I came to the conclusion of was that I had spent, necessary time. It wasn't wasted time, but I'd basically spent all this time writing the Jesus Un series, and essentially they're books on theology, right? And what is theology? Theology is the study of God. And who is God? Well, God is this being beyond all human comprehension. And I felt like, it's kind of insane to say that God is a being beyond all comprehension, and then the next thing you say is, "Let me tell you all about him." Um, so I kind of felt like what I needed to do was kind of like back off of that. Again, as part of the Square One community, like one thing I started telling people all the time was like, in all of your deconstructing your theology, I strongly urge you to deconstruct your need to be right about everything, to let
Mm.
go of that need to be certain and right, to not get your safety and your comfort from tricking yourself, really, because no one knows, right? But telling yourself that you're certain about this theological truth, because you're not. You believe it. I don't doubt you believe it, but you don't know it. You believe it. It's faith, right? You hope. Um, and at least for me, sometimes those beliefs and those hopes change. And you don't want to get too tight fisted with those belief systems, because especially if you're going to change your mind in a few years, you're going to feel stupid, And it's like this thing of like, no matter how many times I change my mind, I'm always right. Um, you know, because that happened to me. I believe something, and then I'm right. And then I read and I study, and I change my mind again. Okay, now I'm right. And I can argue with people about why I'm right. And then a few years later, I change my mind again, and now I'm still right. And I realized like that is just the wrong. That's how I was behaving, but that was the wrong way to behave. That actually, what I would, to be more honest and humble, what I should actually say is, I was wrong before, and I'm probably wrong about some things now, and I bet I'm going to be wrong in the future. So being right isn't the goal. I don't think, the gospel is not about having the right information about God. It's not like passing some cosmic quiz when you die. That's not what it's about. It's not about information. I think the gospel is about transformation, and I think transformation, you can experience a life changing, transformational experience with God, and have some like really weak theology. You could be an 8-year-old girl and you don't know anything about the first thing about theology, but you definitely have a connection with God, and a genuine, spiritual connection. So for me, I started making a shift in that direction. That's kind of where I am now. That's when I wrote Solo Mysterium, celebrating the beautiful uncertainty of everything. I just started, moving more into that uh, cultivating and developing a sense of awe and curiosity and wonder when it comes to God. Not focused on what I think I know, which is almost nothing, but to focus on what I don't know, which is almost infinite when it comes to God. So yeah, so that's when I wrote Sola Mysterium. During that time, I also started really looking into the quantum physics stuff and noticing how much what quantum physics is saying now echoes some things that Jesus has said, also echoes things other mystics have said throughout history, which is really fascinating and exciting. So I wrote Sola Deus, which is the second book, the follow-up book to Sola Mysterium, and talked about a few other things in that book about experiencing God. And then I started writing these books on the quantum series, right? So I have 2 books so far in the quantum series. The Quantum Sayings of Jesus looks at the Gospel of Thomas, again through the lens of this quantum physics. And then I wrote the Quantum Gospel of Mary and the Lost Gospel of Truth, and that came out a couple of months ago. And yeah, so I'm working on 2 more books actually right now in that quantum series, which hopefully will be out next year.
Nice. I want to get back to that maybe a bit in a moment because I'm curious about the title, but I want to go back because I'm curious also about what motivated you to start Square One, this
Uh-huh.
group for deconstruction. And you also mentioned briefly in passing earlier about having your own deconstruction experience. And I think you placed that during the time you were involved in the Vineyard Church plant.
Yes,
But
yes.
I would curious to know what your deconstruction, what that meant, or what that looked like for you,
Mhm.
and how I assume it's tied into your inspiration for doing Square One. And but yeah,
Yeah,
if you could, I'm just
yeah, yeah.
curious about how that went.
Yeah, yeah. So my deconstruction process was sort of twofold. I already mentioned one of them, which was that Ray Mayhew article about how the early church cared for the poor, and then that made Wendy and I want to step away and start this house church thing. So that was part of it. The other half of it was, again, I mentioned I was writing for Relevant Magazine, and it was during the time that we were also at that church, the Vineyard Church in Tustin, and I interviewed this guy, and I asked him during the interview, like, "What's the biggest what's the biggest problem with the church in America today?" And his answer really just kind of blew my mind. Again, I was licensed and ordained as a minister. I'm on staff at a church. Had been on staff at different churches over the years. Was writing, a blog about Christian things and theology and things like that. And his answer blew my mind. He said, "The biggest problem with the church in America today is they don't understand the gospel." And I said,
Hmm.
"Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, the gospel's not about saying a prayer so you can go to heaven when you die." And I didn't know what to say. Like no one had ever told me that. What are you talking about? So I said, "Well, can you elaborate?" What do you mean by that? He goes, "Well, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the gospels in the New Testament, Jesus gives us the gospel. It's the good news. And he says the good news, the gospel is this: the kingdom of God is within you. It's not something you have to wait until you're after you're dead to experience. You could live a kingdom life right now." And man, I had never heard that. It just wrecked me. And I always say it rearranged the spiritual furniture in my mind and my heart. Um, and so that was it. I mean, I remember that night I couldn't sleep. I got up and I was sitting in the living room talking to God, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, if I'm wrong about the gospel,
Hmm.
what else am I wrong about? What else am I getting wrong?" So again, so around that time we left that church, we started the house church, and because we had left the Vineyard Church and we were starting our own house church, we didn't do it under any kind of like denominational thing. So I was not I didn't have anybody telling me, you can't read that book or you can't ask that question or anything like that. So the house church experience was also a time where we were free, to just explore and to learn and to ask questions and all that stuff. So that's kind of what I did. I started asking questions and reading a whole bunch of different things and doing some study of my own in like church history and things like that. And And one by one, these kind of like these pillars, I think there's like 6 pillars that I've identified in the Christian faith, that one by one, those pillars started to fall or at least shift for me. And I didn't lose my faith, but it definitely, I say, because a lot of times people will say, "Oh, Keith, you're a progressive Christian." I say, "No, I'm a regressive Christian." I feel like I've gone back to Jesus, like to a first century way of
Yeah.
thinking of Jesus. So it's regressive; it's not progressive at all. Um, but yeah, so that was my journey, and that's what set me off on that journey. So square one, I started. So this was after that we basically, the house church had finished its life cycle, and it lasted for about 11 years. I took a job in Boise, Idaho. We moved to Boise, Idaho. Um, and I had started to do some online classes for some of my books through this other Christian university. They called me and offered me like, "Hey, do you want to teach some classes based on Jesus Untangled, Jesus Unbound?" I'm like, "Sure, okay." So I
That's
was already
cool.
teaching some online classes through them, and that was a great experience. I'm glad they invited me because I would have never really dipped my toes in that before without that nudge. And so what I started noticing, well, what is it, just experiencing was like, because I've published books now and I'm blogging and I have a podcast, right? People message me all the time. They send me private messages and they're like, "Hey, Keith," or shoot me an email or something. Like, they'd ask me questions about the Bible, or they'd ask me questions about their deconstruction, or what do I do about this and what do I do about that. And I'm happy to help them and answer their questions. And I do that 2 or 3 times a day. But I started noticing, like, I would never hear from some of these people. Like, what happened? I don't get any. I have no continuity with what happened next. And so I was around that time, I was thinking like I wanted to start my own kind of online learning platform. And I was thinking about, okay, what kind of a course should I start? And there's like a little course that I took that gets you to ask some questions, like, what's something that you have expertise in? And you have expertise because it's something people spontaneously will email you and ask you questions about this topic. And I'm like, oh, well, that's easy. That's deconstruction. They ask me this all the time. So anyway, I just kind of put together the idea for square one. The goal was to create a course that so it ran for 12 weeks. I recorded 12 modules, 12 1-hour sessions. Each session was on a specific topic of deconstruction. And then I would give them a little bit of a homework. So the goal was like they would listen to the video, watch the video on like a Monday. They'd have homework during the week. And then on Saturday, we'd have a 1-hour Zoom call together, just to touch base. How are you doing? How do you feel about this? And blah, blah, blah. I was very careful not to tell people this is how to deconstruct. I
Yeah.
told them, look, everyone's going to be different. Some of you are at the end of this, you're going to decide you're not a Christian anymore, but that's your path. Some of you are going to be like, "Hey, I reject everything, but I'm going to hold on to Jesus." And some of you are going to be like, "Well, I reject this, but I hold on to that," or whatever, and everything in between, and that's okay. And none of us, the goal is not for any of us in this group to deconstruct the same way, but it's for us to be there for one another as we're figuring it out, right? And it was beautiful, honestly. Those I did that for like 6 years.
Hmm.
Um, and I didn't have a Saturday free for like 6 years. Like every Saturday,
Gosh.
I had a square one call for an hour on a Zoom call for an hour, and then once I started square two, after that I'd have a square two call for an hour with those people. And but you know what? Those calls were really powerful and important because when you go through deconstruction, you feel very isolated. You feel very alone. It doesn't matter if there's 200 people in your zip code who are deconstructing. You don't know who they are. You don't know them. And so you feel very alone. You feel also rejected by your church, your family, because how dare you have asked these questions? How dare you not believe what I believe? And so it can be
It's
very
kind of like
painful.
the house churches where
Yeah.
like they're out there, but it's hard to find.
Yes, exactly. Although in deconstruction, it's just you. You're alone. Like you don't have anyone
Yeah.
else. So
Yeah.
so providing it's really the bottom line was the best thing about the square one experience was not my 12 sessions. I mean, that just got them thinking. What I learned was the best thing about it were those Zoom calls, because we'd get on those Zoom calls and everybody's on the little Brady Bunch squares on the Zoom call. and someone starts to tell their story, and everybody else on that on all the other squares, they start nodding their heads or they're wiping away a tear because they're like, yes, I feel, yes, that's what I went through. Yes. And all of a sudden they're not alone, and they feel that connection and community that, oh my gosh, I felt this whole time that I was the only one who felt this way. And now there's like 20 other people right now that they all get it, you know? So that was beautiful. That was very powerful. And that's the reason why, like when I did Square One, my goal was, again, just from the house church experience, I'm not anybody's guru. I don't want anyone to follow me. I didn't want to turn this into the Keith Giles Club, right? So my whole thing at the end of Square One was, okay, we're done. Bye. See you later. You know, have a good life. And but then they didn't want to go away because they had connected so well on the Zoom calls. They were like, but we love each other. We want to stay together. Can we just keep doing these Zoom calls? So I was like, okay. So I came up with Square Two, which turned out to be even better than Square One because I interviewed all these other amazing people about specific topics, and we had conversations, and then they would react to those conversations. So I had people like Paul Young, Brad Jerzak, David Bentley Hart, Brian Zahn, Jim Palmer, tons of people um, who recorded sessions for the Square Two, and then we had Zoom calls for that. And so, yeah, it was just a beautiful opportunity to see these people kind of heal and find community and connection and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that was the idea behind Square One and Two and Three. Like right now, it's like I said, it's mainly just Square Three. I have a few people that are in Square One. I used to sell those courses, but I kind of lately just made them free. So if any of your listeners want to join Square One for free, if you feel like, hey, I need something like this, yeah, I'll send you a link and you can share that with anybody that wants it, or they can contact me and I'll send it to them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So, jumping back to the quantum books that you're
Yeah.
kind of that's where you're at as far as writing right now.
Yeah.
I am curious because from the titles alone, I didn't really understand where the quantum came from, and in fact, uh, seeing that the first one, the quantum sayings of Jesus, was in regards to the Gospel of Thomas, and if I remember right, is it the Gospel of Thomas that's a collection of a lot of Jesus sayings?
Yes, that's
And
all
so
it
I
is.
thought maybe that was it because it's like quantum sayings, but it sounds like maybe that's not
No.
how you came up with quantum.
No. So the way I came up with the quantum sayings of Jesus in the title was the first time I read the Gospel of Thomas, somebody told me, you should read it. And I tried reading it and I just thought it was stupid. It made no sense to me. It was gobbledygook. I just thought it was nonsense. Like, how could anyone take this seriously? And I just put it aside. But then about like 4 or 5 years ago, somebody mailed me. This happens to you too, by the way, when you're an author. People just send me books. Someone sent me a book in the mail. I don't even know who sent it to me. And it was a book about Thomas by this guy named William Duffy. And the next day, I was going to take a flight. So I just stuck it in my bag and I'm on the plane. I pull it off, pull out the book. I start reading the book. And the introduction of the book, he says, most people read the Gospel of Thomas and it makes no sense to them. And I'm like, yes, you're right. Okay. I'm with you so far. And then he said, well, the reason why it makes no sense is that you have to understand that all of the sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, they only make sense if you read them as Jesus trying to say something about our connection to God or our connection to one another. And I was like, huh. So then I started looking at it and I was like, oh, this guy's right. He's exactly right. So then I got excited about reading Thomas. And when I was reading Thomas then through that perspective, that's when I started to note, because I had just written the book Sola Mysterium and I just looked into all the quantum stuff, right? So now I'm reading Thomas, and it turns out that reading Thomas through this lens of either our connection with God or our connection with one another, that is a quantum perspective, because quantum is all about how everything is the quantum field and the quantum field is everything. We're all expressions. Everything in the universe is the expression of one thing, which is the quantum field. That's how quantum physics describes it. But if you just change the word quantum field for Christ, it's the same thing that Jesus says, Paul says, all the mystics have said, that we are all connected to the divine. And because we are all one with God, we're also one with one another. There's no separation between us and God, and there's no separation between us and one another. And so that's the quantum sort of filter that made Thomas make sense. And then reading Thomas, the sayings of Jesus and Thomas through that lens, there's like 114 sayings. Half of them are in the Gospels we already have. The other half are brand new. They're unique to Thomas. Yeah, it was just mind blowing just to see like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. It was very, very cool. So I got very excited about that, published that book. That book came out more than a year ago. I think it came out in like April of last year. And it's still in the top 20 in its category in Amazon. I've never had a book
No.
do that well. I mean, it was like it was in the top 10 for the first year. It's only been in the last 4 or 5 months it's dropped to the top 20. But so then I wrote Quantum Gospel of Mary and the Lost Gospel of Truth, kind of doing the same thing, like reading the Gospel of Mary through that lens. And there's another book, a Nag Hammadi book called The Gospel of Truth. So both of those books I cover in that book. Yeah, and so it's just been really exciting to kind of discover an early Christianity, because there was a um, Christian community called the Valentinians, which I only discovered by studying a book by Elaine Pagels, Dr. Elaine Pagels. She has
Yeah.
a book called Beyond Belief, fantastic book. So when I was studying for Thomas, writing the Thomas book, I read her book, and she kind of talks about the Valentinian Christians who were the ones who really they really preferred the Gospel of Thomas and things like that, the Gospel of Truth and things like that. So seeing that there was an early group of Christians who were already on that wavelength, they were already thinking that way, was pretty exciting. And so yeah, I'm writing 2 more books right now. I'm working on the Quantum Gospel of Philip right now. And I'm also writing a book on the sayings of Paul, the quantum sayings of Paul from his letters.
Great. Well, we'll have those to look forward to.
Yeah, next year, I hope.
Yeah. So I kind of do want to wrap up here, and thank you for your time.
Sure.
Um, so I want to wrap up by asking. Uh, Clearly, you're involved in writing more books right now. I know you've had a couple of the podcasts. We didn't really talk about that too much, but I know you've done that.
Yeah.
You have the Square thing going on to some degree or another.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, from my perspective, you have all these things you're involved in. I didn't know which things you wanted to highlight beyond your books. If you want to let people know which things you have going on, anything you want to, let the world know about.
Well, oh my gosh. So we've covered a bunch of stuff. Yeah, I do. I've been doing Heretic Happy Hour podcast with Matthew DiStefano for about 8 years or so. Still loving it. It's been a lot of fun. And so check that out. It's not for everybody, but you might like it if you check it out. I also have a solo podcast called Second Cup with Keith, which I don't do it as often. I used to do it like at least once or twice a month, but lately I've been too busy to keep up with it. But it's still out there if you want to check that out. I mean, one thing I'm doing right now that we didn't talk about is like, I became the co-owner of Choir Publishing. So even though Choir was my publisher, Raphael Polindo was the guy that owned it. Matthew DiStefano and I, who do the podcast together, also became co-owners of Choir Publishing about 3 years ago. And that's been amazing, just to be able to help other authors, So like part of my job at Choir is I review books that people send to us or pitches for books they send to us. I meet with authors. I see if they're a fit for us, help them with their book, getting it published, and working with them on things like that. And so that's been really rewarding. It's been really nice to. And lately, I feel like we've published some younger authors that really give me a lot of hope. There's a guy named Jackson Phoenix. We just published his book called Only Us that I wrote the forward to it, and yeah, I believe beautiful, amazing things for this guy. Watch him; he's going to be the next guy to write a 7-part book series. He's really great. And another one coming out by a guy named John Suarez that'll be out, I think, next month, actually, in December. That's called The Outsider's Banquet. It's just a really amazing book, very creative, and it's things like that. So we're choir. When Matt and I took over choir, choir has always been known for sort of challenging the status quo, publishing books on deconstruction, and kind of the books that I've been writing and things like that. So nonfiction theology that kind of challenges the status quo, and we're always going to do that. Like choir's never going to get away from that. But what Matt and I have also tried to do is to publish other things too. So we're publishing like poetry, fiction, science fiction. We did a children's book. We did an art book already with Kevin Max. We're going
Oh
to be
yeah.
doing we're going to be doing another book with another artist coming up like in January. So, that's been a lot of fun too, is to expand it, to just be a publisher and publish things that we believe in, artists and writers and creators that we believe in. So that's been a lot of fun. I'm doing a lot of things. I'm trying to still, though, it's hard to juggle being an author and running a publishing company and blogging and podcasting and all that other stuff. But I'm very blessed in that this is my full-time job. Like this is what I get to do. Uh, and I never thought I could do this before, but it's kind of a dream come true for me that I get to wake up every morning, work from home, and everything I'm working on is stuff I believe in and stuff I want to do. And so yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad you are in that position now.
Yeah.
That's great. Any final word that you want to express to the audience about, out of your passion, like your message to everyone?
Yeah. Well, I guess, okay, like a final thought. Well, something that I say a lot when I talk about, um, and I've had opportunity to do a lot more speaking lately, at different churches and things like that, different events. That's also been something I've been doing lately. That's been a lot of fun. And so especially when I talk about the quantum stuff, I always say, like, to me, this kind of stuff is the answer to everything. And one day I might write a book called The Answer to Everything. Um, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple. It's realizing, like, this idea that we're all connected to God and that we're all connected to one another. Like, if we can really get this as individuals, but also just as humanity, I say it's the answer to everything because I feel like if you honestly can look at your neighbor and you don't see your neighbor, you see yourself, you know, that's how you love your neighbors yourself. If you can look at your enemy and you don't see an enemy, you see Christ in him. That's how you love your neighbor, love your enemy. You know what I mean? Um, like if we really can get it, if we can really understand that we're all connected to God and we're all connected to one another, I think it changes everything. Right? It's the end of uh, genocide. It's an end to war. It's an end to poverty. It's an end to prejudice and racism because you will no longer accept any idea that tell anyone who tells you, this us and them mentality. Right? Everything right now that we are experiencing, especially in social media, but in the world right now, is like it's all every day, all day. All the messages we hear constantly is it's this us versus them message, right? It's Democrats versus Republicans. It's Jews versus Muslims. It's pick something. It's always this group versus that group, and you know people benefit from convincing us that's reality. And I don't think it is reality. I think that is what Jesus was telling us. I think that's what Paul was telling us. I think that's what quantum physics is showing us, is that those are illusions. This idea that we're separated from one another because of religion or politics or ideology or gender or any of those things, that those are illusions. That's not true. The reality is we are all connected to one another. We have a shared divinity and a shared humanity. And so for me, I want to encourage anyone, like, the more you lean into that, the more you really understand that and you start living out of that reality, I think it'll change you and I think it'll change our world, because I don't think the world's going to change until we change. And
Yeah.
for me, that's such a fundamental thing that I think
Yeah.
we have to get to this place of, I mean, and really, isn't that what Jesus said, right? What are the two greatest commandments? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbors yourself. The first is like the second is like the first. Those two things are intertwined. And
Yeah.
so loving God is reflected in the way we love one another and vice versa. You can't separate those two things. So for me, yeah, that's just been, it's very simple and very fundamental. I know it's not something no one's ever heard before, but for me, the more I think about it, I feel like this is what I want. This is going to be my message. I want people to get this. And I'm trying to get it myself, but the more we can live into it, I think that's our best hope.
Great. I appreciate you sharing that. And again, I appreciate you taking the time. And it's been interesting. I've enjoyed um, getting to hear a little bit more about your experience. Obviously, we covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
but yeah, it is fascinating. And I do appreciate your passion and your heart. I know some people find some of the things you say controversial, but obviously your heart behind it is, like you said, that message of love and God's love, and
Yeah.
so yeah, and I appreciate that.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, thank you very much, and we'll wrap up here.
All right. Thanks, Doug.
Hey, thank you for listening to this episode. Please be sure to like and subscribe so that you'll get notified of all future interviews.